The New Orleans Saints do not land wide receiver Davante Adams in a trade, but it's not who they didn't get that's the big concern. It's who they may be without. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, I broke down not only the New Orleans Saints missed tackles, but the missed tackle numbers from around the NFL. I'll tell you where the New Orleans Saints rank and why missed tackles have been so detriment to the New Orleans Saints defense. We'll also take a look at why the New Orleans Saints don't need to really be in any trade markets, or at least most trade markets for the rest of this season. And we're going to kick everything off with a look at the New Orleans Saints' concern when it comes to the wide receiver room, not because they didn't add a player, but because they might be losing their two best. We're going to break all that down here on today's show. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. The New Orleans Saints did not land Davante Adams. Las Vegas Raiders trading him over to the New York Jets. And while we're not entirely surprised by that, it does still feel like a net loss for the New Orleans Saints. But it doesn't feel like a net loss because the Saints didn't get Davante Adams. It feels like a net loss because the Saints are losing wide receiver availability and talent by the day. New Orleans Saints wide receiver Chris Olave, of course, in concussion protocol right now, could be available for Thursday's game, but seems highly unlikely. Typically takes a little bit of time to get through that concussion protocol, even if you do it within 1 week. But we'll see where things go for Chris Olave, but a chance that he may not be available after suffering his third NFL concussion, or third concussion in his NFL career so far. But to compound on top of that, reports from Nick Underhill over at NewOrleans.football, as well as Ian Rappaport with NFL Network, say that Rashid Shaheed's knee injury that had him as an estimated DNP on Monday's practice may be a pretty significant issue, and therefore his status moving forward is, as Ian Rappaport listed it, TBD, to be determined. So they're doing tests, they're checking in to see. They do believe that this might be a considerable issue, but how long will Rashid Shaheed be out? That's the question at this time. And look, Rashid Shaheed being out for any amount of time, and especially compounded with the potential to not have Chris Olave on Thursday, that's huge for the New Orleans Saints, whose only real home run hitter has been Rashid Shaheed. He's really your best scoring potential so far this year in the passing game, as Alvin Kamara and Taysom Hill have been your others in the run game. And the Saints' run game may not ever get off the ground up against the Denver Broncos, and the Saints have still not been able to develop any kind of second punch, right? And Rashid Shaheed has kind of been a little bit of that second punch every now and then, right? Big, deep touchdown a couple weeks ago. We see it over and over again with him. Most, I believe it's 40-yard touchdowns since 2022 in the NFL. And things are going to be tough if the Saints don't have either of these wide receivers. Why? Because their run game is not going to see a lot of success, very likely, up against the Denver Broncos. According to Next Gen Stats, New Orleans Saints have run outside the tackle 72.8% of the time. That's the second most, for any team in the NFL. But on the other side of that, the Denver Broncos are surrendering one of the lowest success rates, the second lowest explosive run rates as well in the NFL, 2 runs outside of the tackles, which means the New Orleans Saints run game, again, may not get off the ground this week, which has been the case for the past couple of weeks. Certainly was the case against the Philadelphia Eagles weeks ago in week 3. Was certainly the case up against the Kansas City Chiefs last week, and certainly, or I guess the week before last now. And then, of course, was not the case. They were not able to get it off the ground up against Tampa Bay Buccaneers this past weekend. So if the Saints aren't able to get their run game going up against Denver, they're going to have to rely on rookie quarterback Spencer Rattler and rookie rookie wide receivers, Bub Means, as well as Mason Tipton, along with veteran wide receiver Cedric Wilson Jr. That's not to say that the Saints can't move the ball with those guys, but they certainly miss out when they don't have Chris Olave and when they don't have Rashid Shaheed. Next man up's a great mentality to have in the NFL. Next man up's a great mentality to have in sports, but you're going to have a drop off. There's a reason why top players get paid top money and other players don't. So you're going to have a little bit of a drop off. And especially when you're going from guys that are experienced within your system to majority rookies kind of leading the way, or as I said earlier, Wookiees leading the way, it's going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging for the New Orleans Saints. And it gets even more challenging because another reason why the Saints run game might struggle up against the Denver Broncos. Remember those 5 and 6 man fronts that the Philadelphia Eagles and the Kansas City Chiefs deployed against the Saints run game? Well, Denver right now, according to Next Gen Stats, is aligned in 5-man fronts, a league high 46% of plays this season. And that has been one of the biggest kryptonites to the New Orleans Saints run game are those 5 and 6 man fronts when deployed. But you're certainly going to see a lot of 5-man fronts up against Denver. Now, Spencer Rattler did pretty well up against 5-man fronts and against the blitz last week, according to Next Gen Stats, 6 of 13 for 100 yards, a touchdown, and an interception against the blitz in his first start against Tampa Bay. So you could see a little bit of the passing game maybe working off of that if Spencer Rattler is able to remain composed. But we also know that the blitz is what ended up changing the game in the second half of the game against Tampa because of the amount of pressure that they were able to get, particularly unblocked free runners up the middle right in Spencer Rattler's face. Those created some issues for the New Orleans Saints team. So you look at the 5-man fronts, you look at the Denver Broncos' success against the outside run. That's going to put a lot of emphasis on Spencer Rattler and the passing game to be able to move the football if the Saints can't get their run game off the ground, which feels like might be likely unless the New Orleans Saints have figured out some kind of magical remedy against the thing that they've struggled against when it comes to run defenses lined up across from them over the course of the past few weeks in a mere couple of days because of the tight turnaround from Tampa to Denver. Can the Saints do it? 100%, right? Like teams figure this stuff out all the time, and it doesn't matter the timeline. Cam Jordan talking about how upset the team is. I won't say the word that he said because I don't know if you're listening in the car with your kids or something like that. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say peeved, right? A little bit peeved. And so I think that is something that you look at for this team going into Thursday's game. Can that make the difference for them if they go in and play just mad because they're very upset with what it is that they put on display on Sunday up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? I don't know if that's going to be enough. Schematically, this is something that the New Orleans Saints have not figured out yet. How do you get your offense rolling when you can't get your run game going? And now they have to try to figure out how to do that without possibly their top 2 wide receivers. That, to me, is a greater concern than the Saints not pulling off the trade for Davante Adams. And in fact, I'll go a step further. I don't think the New Orleans Saints should be looking to be buyers at all for the rest of the season, and instead may need to consider being sellers in the very few opportunities that they have. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, FanDuel not looking at the New Orleans Saints too favorably in this one. The Saints underdogs at home yet again, +1.5 in this one. So basically, you think the New Orleans Saints can upset, or you think they're going to lose to the Denver Broncos. That's kind of your bet at this point, unless you think it might be a 1-point game. That's what you're basically looking at over at FanDuel. So if you want to check that out and then get in on some of the other odds in action, college basketball on the way, college football underway, the MLB, of course, with the playoffs, so much for you to check out over at FanDuel. You can get in on it all over at FanDuel.com. And right now, if you're a new customer, even better time to get started because you get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's your first $5 bet. You're going to get $200 guaranteed as a first-time customer. Doesn't get any better than that. Go and check them out today, FanDuel.com. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks, the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports. You think that Patrick Mahomes is going to go for more than 267.5 passing yards? How about Tyreek Hill? More than 97.5 receiving yards. Maybe you think less. That's the kind of question that you're answering over at Prize Picks, and that's what ends up giving you the opportunity to potentially get up to 100 times your entry back. Yeah, it's really that easy. You pick 2 to 6 players, do exactly what we just did. You pick more or less than that prize picks projection, and then boom. If you get 4 of those right, you can win up to 100 times your entry back. Absolutely love prize picks. It's fun. It's you versus the house. It's you and your knowledge of your favorite sport, favorite teams, favorite players. And that's it. It's not you versus, this, that, and the other, and mystery lineups and all that good stuff. So go and check them out today. Download the Prize Picks app and use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. All right, family. The New Orleans Saints might have not been able to get a trade done for Davante Adams, and likely for good reason. I'll dive into that. But I don't think the New Orleans Saints need to be concerned with looking at other wide receiver options on the market if they want to be honest with themselves. The New Orleans Saints very likely didn't make a move for Davante Adams simply because of the fact that what the Las Vegas Raiders wanted in terms of trade compensation, the New Orleans Saints were not willing to surrender. The Jets ended up sending a conditional 3rd round pick that can convey into a 2nd round pick based on different things, right? All Pro, Pro Bowl nods, things like that. But for New Orleans, that's probably not something that they were willing to do. You look at some of the reporting from senior NFL insider Josina Anderson, that seemed to always sort of be the division between the two teams. There was mutual interest from the Saints to Adams and from Adams to the Saints, which may have changed based on a 4-game losing streak, as well as losing the quarterback that was the draw for him in Derek Carr for multiple games. But in any case, initially at least, there was that back and forth interest. But the Saints were very unlikely to pick up any of that contract, or were very unlikely to try to absorb that $13+ million contract from where the conversation began. It chipped away each week based on game checks, proration, things like that. But the Jets, for instance, took on the entire salary of that base salary of that trade. The Raiders didn't have to eat anything. And the Jets still gave up a pick that can turn into a 2nd round pick. There's no way the New Orleans Saints are going to be interested in doing that. And very likely they were going to have to give away a 2nd round pick in order to get the Raiders to agree to facilitate the financial side of it all to take on and eat some of that salary, which the Raiders were very much not willing to do without the price going up, which makes sense, right? You're asking a team to do that. You're going to have to pay a little bit of a premium in terms of that move. So the Saints not making that move, not a bad choice, especially considering where they've ended up here over the course of the past few weeks. Injuries to both their starting wide receivers, as we just laid out, injuries to your starting left guard, starting right guard, starting center, starting quarterback. Your running back is dealing with 3 different injuries, and Taysom Hill, the guy that effectively has been sort of the most important piece to your offense, has been missing with injuries to his abdomen, rib injuries as well. So you've got 8 of your top 11 players that hit the field effectively, or top 12 or 13 players that end up hitting the field effectively out or managing actively some kind of injury. The Saints aren't really in a situation where they can turn around and say, oh, 1 piece away. That just doesn't feel like that's where this team is anymore. That might have been the case week 1, right? Week 1, to where you looked at this team who was exciting and electrifying and had this offense that was tearing everything apart, did it again in week 2, had a good enough defense that was holding things down with the complementary play of the offense, all those other pieces. You might have looked at that offense and said, man, if the Saints just had this one other piece, they'd be unstoppable. And then weeks 3, 4, 5, and 6 happened. And now the conversation is very different for this New Orleans Saints team. And I'm not trying to be unfair. I'm not trying to be insulting or anything like that. I'm just kind of being realistic about where this New Orleans Saints team is right now. And this New Orleans Saints team at this moment doesn't strike me as a team that really should be considering itself a buyer. This is a team that might need to start considering the possibility of considering themselves, well, the opposite, a seller, or at least, if anything, remain abstinent in the whole thing. No need to add, no need to give away. You certainly don't have a lot that you can give away from a contract standpoint because of the amount of restructures and things like that have happened. It's not like the Saints are going to be able to move any player out that's going to return them additional draft value so that they can start to basically have a youth movement for their team. But there is something to the idea this team might be stuck in a situation, whether they want to admit it or not, which I don't imagine they would want to admit it. In fact, they shouldn't admit it. because you want to remain competitive. You want to stay open to the possibility that you could sneak in towards the end of the season. But this team should evaluate the talent that it has on its roster and start to build information in terms of the very tough decisions that might have to be made at the end of this season. That just might be where New Orleans is. Now, they won't admit that. They hate saying that out loud. They're going to hate hearing me say that. They're going to hate hearing anybody say that. As well, they should. They should approach every game for the rest of the season like a team that can win that game. There's absolutely no doubt about that. You're in the NFL. Everyone's dream that's on that roster is to be in the NFL. Everyone's dream that's on that roster is to compete. They should go out there and they should compete. And in the meanwhile, you're getting a solid evaluation of the players that you have on the roster so that you can make some tough decisions this offseason, because I think that's where this New Orleans Saints team might be headed to. I reluctantly picked this team to win the under in terms of its win total, 7.5 points or 7.5 wins. The reason that I picked this team to do that is because I wasn't sure if the offense was going to start up right away. It did. It just hasn't maintained. And I did not trust this team's ability to stay healthy. This organization has not shown in the past, go back however many years you want to, right? 2021. I excuse the 2020 season because obviously that was a very different situation for everyone involved. But if you look at this team's health issues over the course of the past, really go back to 2019, especially at the quarterback position, this team has not shown a propensity to stay healthy. This has been a big struggle for them. It's not something that I look at and I point fingers and I say it's this's fault, it's that's fault or whatever. It's just that's been an issue for this team. And because of that, it was hard to really believe that this team was going to be able to just magically not deal with the injuries that they've been dealing with year after year after year at the core positions, by the way, the most important positions, right? We're not talking about, some injuries to guys that contribute on special teams, as important as that would still be. You're talking about guys that are the starting quarterback, starting wide receivers, starting interior offensive line, and some of your best playmakers that are managing injuries, even if they're not missing games, like an Alvin Kamara. And boy, can we talk about Alvin Kamara, who did not get the contract extension that he was looking for and has now played through rib injuries, hand injury. He's played through other injuries already so far this season, broken ribs, hip injury. That was the other one. If you ever needed an example of not giving up on a team, that's a pretty dang good one right there. But I digress from all of that because all of that is contextual to say this New Orleans Saints team might be in a situation where they need to start evaluating their roster and maybe should be more concerned with stockpiling or maintaining draft capital, i.e. not sending it away. They should be more interested and invested in that than sending draft capital away to get a big name player to come to your team that's still dealing with so many injuries, right? Like that would not fix the New Orleans Saints' biggest issues, which is that this team can barely field at the moment. 17 players listed on the injury report. That's more than a starting lineup. 17 players listed on an injury report. Now, some of those players were still full participants. A lot of them were limited participants. They were still out on the field, which again shows you the dedication of the players. But 17 players listed on the injury report, 17 players dealing with some kind of injury. It's not a good look. It's tough. It's tough out there for the New Orleans Saints. And I don't think that giving up future assets to bring in a player for a year is really going to be the most advantageous use of what little capital they do have left this season. Coming up next, taking a look at missed tackles, how they plagued the team, and where the New Orleans Saints actually rank across the league when it comes to those missed tackles. Spoiler alert, it's not great. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends at Game Time, the absolute best place to go and buy tickets, whether you're planning months in advance or moments in advance. But I'm a moments in advance guy, which is my favorite part about Game Time, because tickets to your favorite events, whether it's sports, comedy, musicals like theater, concerts, whatever it is that you're looking for, you can find all of it. And those tickets get cheaper, typically speaking, as you get closer to the start of the event. For instance, right now, what used to be $200 tickets to the Thursday night football game between the New Orleans Saints and the Denver Broncos. You can currently get one in the 634 section, or a pair of tickets in the 634 section. So that corner at the home sideline for $50 a pop. And if you turn in all-in pricing, you won't have to worry about any surprise fees at the end. Just toggle the option on. You could also see views from the seats before you purchase the tickets as well. There's just not a better ticket buying experience than what Game Time provides. And honestly, you're going to get all the best deals over at Game Time as well. So go and check them out today. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. I should have titled this episode Tell the Truth Tuesday, because that's what this feels like, right? We're telling the truth about the Saints wide receiver spot, the struggles that they'll face against the Denver Broncos in the run game. We're telling the truth about where this team truly should see itself, even if they don't want to say it publicly, right? And they shouldn't say it publicly, but where they should see themselves in terms of like competitor, buyer, seller, wherever you want to look at it. And we're going to tell the truth again. And the truth that I want to tell this time as we wrap up the show is that the Saints have a missed tackling problem. Wow, great analysis, Ross. But let me give you more of the information behind it. So the Saints right now sit with 56 total missed tackles on the season, 18 through the first 3 games, 38 through the most recent 3 games. So you can feel the sense of urgency when you hear Cam Jordan and Dennis Allen. We'll speak with Joe Woods later on today and others who have all kind of echoed the concerns with missed tackles and why that has ended up causing the team such grief. So the Saints right now with 56 missed tackles, including the Monday Night Football numbers, across the entire NFL, the Saints are tied for the 9th highest total of missed tackles in the NFL. They're actually tied with the San Francisco 49ers. Some teams that are up above the New Orleans Saints include teams like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Indianapolis Colts and others. So the Saints are not alone or not sitting at the very top of the missed tackle issues when it comes to their sort of what's plaguing their season. They're not kind of alone. In fact, the number one team, remember the Saints are sitting at 56. The number one team in the NFL is the Las Vegas Raiders, sitting at 79. They're averaging 13.17 missed tackles per game. So it could be much worse. The Saints are about to go up against the Denver Broncos, who currently sit with 54 missed tackles, just 2 fewer than the New Orleans Saints, an average of 9 per game, while the Saints sit at 9.33. So the Saints aren't really in like terrible, company or anything. San Francisco 49ers are right there with them. The Buffalo Bills are just behind them. Cincinnati Bengals are just ahead of them, so on and so forth. But look, there's some other teams around them. The Arizona Cardinals, the Cleveland Browns, the Jacksonville Jaguars, not necessarily teams you want to be in company with either. So it kind of, it's a mixed bag of like success of team versus missed tackle rate and everything like that. So you can't really correlate team success or failure with those missed tackles because you kind of see a spattering of it all. It's your ability to overcome those missed tackles, or more importantly, and this is where I want to dive in a little bit deeper with the New Orleans Saints, is what do those missed tackles lead to, right? What is the impact or effect of those missed tackles? Well, for the New Orleans Saints, though, the impact of those missed tackles comes to the tune of 30 explosive plays surrendered so far. Explosive plays defined in this exercise by passes or receptions of 20 plus yards and rushes of 15 plus yards. But it's not really been the run game where the missed tackling has been an issue. We certainly saw that last week, Bucky Irving bouncing off of players, all these other things. But really, the big thing has been yards after catch in the passing game. The New Orleans Saints, as of 6 games into the season, have surrendered 1,018 yards after catch so far this season. That is the number 1 total in the NFL, or the number 32 total, the worst total, the most surrendered. It depends on how you want to look at it. They are actually just 2 yards ahead of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Here's some bad company for you, who right now have 1,016 yards after catch allowed on the season so far. So when you've seen the missed tackles, you've typically seen the missed tackles lead to big catch and runs. Most recently, you'll remember the missed tackle on Chris Godwin, or the 3 missed tackles really on Chris Godwin. Willie Gay Jr. doesn't make the hit. Alante Taylor leads with the shoulder. Paulson Adebo goes for the football. Those are three guys that should have been able to just wrap Chris Godwin up and get him down to the ground. They don't. It turns into a big catch and run touchdown. Look all the way back to week 2. I believe it was Paulson Adebo and Tyrann Mathieu, if I remember correctly, were in position to make a stop on CeeDee Lamb at the catch point on the right sideline. Both missed a tackle. Pew. There goes CeeDee Lamb. Now, the CeeDee Lamb catch and run touchdown was kind of masked and kind of tossed aside because it was like, Dallas scored 19 points. The Saints won by 35. You kind of just shook it off. But it turns out that was just a smaller symptom of what has turned into a very big ailment for this New Orleans Saints team, who right now sit within the top 10 of the NFL when it comes to totals of missed tackles. They also sit right now in the top 10 of the NFL, unsurprisingly, with average tackles missed per game at 9.33. That's also tied for number 9 in the NFL. But, that's one of those ones that's kind of shaky too, because you miss more tackles in some games, you miss less tackles in other games. Some teams played less games than others, all those other things. But an average is typically an average. So it should give you exactly what it is that you're looking for, with 8 teams having already seen a bye week. So New Orleans is struggling to tackle. And they're not only struggling to tackle in a way that's concerning holistically, but they're also struggling to tackle against some teams that other teams aren't struggling to tackle. Let me explain that a little bit better for you. So along with this sort of deep dive on missed tackles, one of the other things that I did was that I went and I calculated missed tackles for all the teams that went against teams that the Saints have already played. And I wanted to see, what do the missed tackles for opponents of the Saints' opponents look like versus the Saints' missed tackle numbers against their opponents? And the first few games were okay. Non-Saints opponents against the Carolina Panthers are averaging 8.2 missed tackles. The Saints only missed 5. Same thing, but against the Cowboys, 7.8. The Saints missed 7. So right around what everyone else is missing against the Dallas Cowboys. The Eagles, the Saints actually did well. The Saints only missed 6 tackles against the Eagles, according to Pro Football Focus. The opponents of the Eagles, non-Saints opponents of the Eagles, 8.75. So a little bit more for the other opponents around them. Same story for the Falcons. Saints missed 10. Non-Saints opponents missed 10.4 on average against Atlanta. So that puts the Saints like right around the typical standing. But here's where things have made a turn over the course of the past 2 games. The Saints missed 13 tackles against the Chiefs. Non-Saints opponents that have played the Chiefs have been missing 8.5 tackles per game. Against the Bucs, the Saints missed 15 tackles. Non-Saints opponents averaging 11 missed tackles per game. So I will say that when it comes to Tampa Bay, teams just be missing tackles against Tampa Bay. That might be a Tampa Bay created thing more than it is a team, a defensive thing. But the Saints still miss more than that already very high average, the highest average of the 6 teams that the New Orleans Saints have played so far, with 11 missed tackles per game by non-Saints opponents. So the Saints have shown a propensity over the course of the past 2 weeks in particular to miss more tackles than other teams are missing against the same opponents. And I think that that's important, because that's a part of what you're looking at for this New Orleans Saints team, is not only where they are in a vacuum, but looking at the rest of the NFL, looking at the other opponents, and looking at the opponents of the Saints' opponents. Where do the Saints rank? And the answer is that over the past 2 weeks, the Saints have not ranked well against that average. And so that's definitely something to watch here going up against Denver. In tomorrow's episode, I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper on the Denver Broncos conversation. We'll get into a little bit more of their defense, the outside zone run, their 5-man fronts, and what they do on the offensive side. And I'm going to bring you the number of the opponents or the number or average number of missed tackles that Denver Broncos opponents have had so far this season, so that we can keep an eye out on it on Thursday to see if the Saints come in at more or less than that number, just like our friends over at Prize Picks. All right, we appreciate you very much. As always, making us your first listen of the day every day. Hope you're okay with this one. It's a little bit of a tell the truth situation here, but this is where the New Orleans Saints are. And if they can bounce back from it, they become the NFL's most surprising team. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Let's see if they can do that. We appreciate you very much for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me in the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing, how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.